This week on Vatican Connections, Pope Francis celebrates All Souls' Day in an Italian cemetery. Sweden welcomes him to commemorate the anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, and we speak to a Lutheran pastor on that important event. Hello and welcome to Vatican Connections. I'm Emily Callan. At the Vatican Thursday, the Holy Father met with representatives of different religions. The meeting was organized by the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue as well as the International Dialogue Center. 200 people attended the audience as part of a conference on religions and mercy. The Pope spoke to them and centered his speech on mercy as the Jubilee year is coming to an end. It is the key to understanding the mystery of man, of that humanity which today too is in great need of forgiveness and peace. With those words, the Holy Father opened his speech on the topic of mercy and described it as a way of life. A life, he said, of disinterested love, fraternal service, and sincere service, which is demanded of all religions. He underlined the need for encounter while avoiding superficial syncretism. Mercy is a theme common to many religious traditions, he pointed out, and so should be concerned with the effects of violence, with sickness, disability, poverty, migrations. Mercy is a summons, the Pope said, to have compassion and openness. He went on to explain where the word mercy comes from, which in Arabic and Hebrew recalls the mother's womb as the deepest source of love. Everyone is called to love in this way, like a mother who never forgets her child and always looks past frailty. On the Feast of All the Souls, as is custom, Pope Francis celebrates Mass in one of Italy's cemetery, typically in Campo Verano Cemetery. But this year he presided the Eucharist in Rome's Prima Porta Cemetery, officially called Flaminio Cemetery, with hundreds of faithful seated among the tombstones. It is tradition in Italy to visit the gravesites of friends and family members who have passed. Italians are even given a holiday to commemorate their loved ones on the eve of All Souls' Day. During the Mass, the Pope reminded faithfuls that to think of death is not a hopeless act, rather it should affirm our hope in the resurrection. He began an improvised homily by recalling the words of Job, who says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth, and I shall see God." Commemorating the deceased is both sad and joyful, the Pope said. We are sad because we are reminded of our dear ones who have gone, but joyful or hopeful because we are also reminded of the future, the hope that is to come. All will have to tread this path, he continued, but hope in the resurrection does not deceive. The Holy Father added that Jesus was the first one to go down this road. Jesus is the one who opened the door for us to enter. And so the Pope concluded by saying all can go home with that certainty in Jesus' words, "I will raise him up on the last day." Did you know? All Souls' Day was first introduced into Catholic tradition by a French abbot named Odilo in the 13th century, thus completing the Triduum of All Hallowtide, which includes Halloween, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day. Praying for the dead was eventually observed over 8 days as of the mid-15th century, but in 1955, Pope Pius XII removed the octave under the liturgical reforms of 1955. The main event of the week, however, was the Pope's trip to Sweden. He spent 2 days in the country to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. This year also marks 50 years of official dialogue between Catholics and Lutherans, and Pope Francis arrived on Monday in Malmö and was welcomed at the airport by the Apostolic Nuncio, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Culture, and a delegation of the Lutheran World Federation. He then paid a courtesy visit to the royal family of Sweden before heading to the cathedral in Lund for a joint ecumenical prayer service between Catholics and Lutherans. Inside the 11th century church, the Pope focused on 50 years of Catholic-Lutheran dialogue and found inspiration in the story of the Last Supper, which allows us to peer into the heart of Christ, said Pope Francis, and feel his desire for the unity of all who believe in him. The prayer service, he added, was a manifestation of this desire and a moment to thank God for all men and women of different Christian traditions who refused to let division win. Coming back to the 50 years of ecumenical dialogue between both churches, Pope Francis insisted they have undertaken a common journey of reconciliation, and they have an opportunity this year in the context of the commemoration to continue this work and mend a critical moment of their history. But this can only be done with God the Father, whose love should inspire us to purify our past, he said, and to work in the present to bring about the future of unity. Calling God the vine dresser, the Holy Father said he was always concerned if we are truly one with him. Though divisions have been a source of suffering, the Pope admitted, he acknowledged areas Lutherans have helped Catholics, namely in recognizing the centrality of sacred scripture. He also mentioned the doctrine of justification, explaining the concept by grace alone reminds us that God always takes the initiative. Finally, ending on the image of the Last Supper, when Jesus asks his disciples to be one, it is so that the world may believe. Pope Francis stressed that Christians must work together to be credible witnesses of mercy in the world. At the end of the prayer service in Lund, Pope Francis and the president of the Lutheran World Federation, Bishop Munib Yunan, signed a joint statement promising to continue the work of dialogue and to be rooted together in prayer and in service to others. This special liturgy was followed by another ecumenical celebration, this time in Sweden's Malmö Arena. Attending were the Pope and leaders of the Lutheran World Federation, and stood in front of a full stadium to pray together for peace in the world, especially in Syria. Representatives of the Vatican's Caritas Internationalis, as well as the Lutheran World Federation's World Service, were also present to sign a declaration promising to work together to help and support refugees. Here's a clip from the Holy Father's speech at the arena from Catholic News Service.
Quiero agradecer a todos los gobiernos que asisten a los refugiados. A todos los gobiernos que asisten a los desplazados y a los que solicitan asilo, porque todas las acciones en favor de esas personas que tienen necesidad de protección representan un gran gesto de solidaridad y de reconocimiento de su dignidad. Para nosotros cristianos es una prioridad salir al encuentro de los desechados, porque son desechados de su patria, de los marginados de nuestro mundo, y hacer palpable la ternura y el amor misericordioso de Dios que no descarta a nadie, sino que a todos acoge. A nosotros, cristianos, hoy se nos pide protagonizar la revolución de la ternura. Doy gracias a Dios por esta conmemoración conjunta de los 500 años de la Reforma que estamos viviendo con espíritu renovado y siendo conscientes que la unidad entre los cristianos es una prioridad porque reconocemos que entre nosotros es mucho más lo que nos une que lo que nos separa.
On his second and final day, he celebrated Mass in Malmö for the solemnity of all the saints with the Catholic community of Sweden, who make up just over 1% of the population, whereas Lutherans number about 60%. The number of Catholics has increased in recent years because of immigration, many coming from Chaldean and Maronite communities. And in his homily, the Holy Father mentioned this coexistence of different peoples and new situations which call upon Christians to respond with fresh spiritual energy, he said. CNS has more.
Bienaventurados los que miran a los ojos a los descartados y marginados, mostrándoles cercanía. Bienaventurados los que reconocen a Dios en cada persona y luchan para que otros también lo descubran. Bienaventurados los que protegen y cuidan la casa común. Bienaventurados los que renuncian al propio bienestar por el bien de otros. Bienaventurados los que rezan y trabajan por la plena comunión de los cristianos.
At the end of his apostolic voyage, the Holy Father boarded the papal plane and gave his usual press conference, a short 40 minutes, and covered a variety of topics. To expand on the Pope's conversation with reporters on his flight back from Sweden is our Italian journalist Matteo Cioffi.
Last Tuesday, returning from Sweden, the Pope spoke with the journalists on the flight, answering their questions about a range of topics, including welcoming refugees, female priests, secularization, and his talks with the Venezuelan president. Commenting on the new direction of Sweden to close its border to refugees, the Pope stressed the clear difference between the migrant, which must be treated with certain rules because they have the right to migrate, and it's regulated by the law, and the refugees who come from a situation of war, hunger and anguish. Thank you, Sweden, for what he has done over the years for this kind of problem. The Pope pointed out that it's not human to close the heart, but at the same time it's necessary to have prudence. The Pontiff added it's very important for any country accepting refugees or migrants to make sure that they also take steps to ensure they are properly integrated in their host nations, a process which takes time. He went on to warn that a country can pay a political price if they take in more refugees that they can integrate properly. In this context, he warned against the formation of ghettos for refugees or migrant communities, saying this was a dangerous development that should be avoided. He was then asked if it will ever be possible for women to be ordained priests in Catholic Church. Pope Francis replied that the last clear word was given by St. John Paul II, and this remains. The Holy Father restated that women can do many things better than men. The Church is feminine, said the Pope. There is no church without this feminine dimension, because it's feminine and Mary is more important than the Apostle in terms of theology and mysticism of the Church. Talking about ecumenism, the Pope recalled two initiatives carried out with other churches, for example with the Evangelical Church in Caserta and with the Valdensian Church in Turin. Both had at their heart the theme of forgiveness to heal past wounds. The Pope admitted that the Catholic Church did not act in a Christian way with them. Finally, he was questioned about his meeting with the Venezuelan President Maduro, and the Holy Father confirmed that he had been asked to mediate in the ongoing dispute between the government and the opposition in that country. He stressed that dialogue is the only way out of this crisis.
Now, we've seen images of the Pope in Sweden, but why was the Pope's visit significant, and does it change anything? Earlier today, I got to speak to Reverend Christian Ciccone, pastor at Martin Luther Evangelical Church in Toronto. The Lutheran community in Canada has also been anticipating the commemoration of the Protestant Reformation. Pastor Christian shared with us his thoughts on the meetings that happened in Sweden and what it means to hold a dialogue between Lutherans and Catholics. Reverend Christian, thanks a lot for being with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So we've been talking a lot about the commemoration and the Pope's trip to Sweden. So what was your first impression of the Pope's visit to Sweden?
First of all, I was overwhelmed that he made all the way to Sweden to celebrate with us Reformation Day, which is a typical Lutheran thing, and we've
Right.
never done that in the last 499 years since Luther started with his 95 Theses. So it's a great joy, and it's just wonderful how the Pope embraces the new ecumenical spirit that is obviously there.
What was unique or different about this particular visit, apart from the fact that it was for the commemoration?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if ever before the Pope and the leaders of the Lutheran World Federation have celebrated worship together. I think it was the first time that they did it in this way.
Right.
And so that's the most significant thing. And yeah, also that they really moved forward. I mean, they talked not only about having prayer together, but there was also signed a document on taking action together
Right.
in Malmö. And then also both mentioned that there might be a perspective for coming to the Lord's table together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exciting. Yeah.
And what do you think is the impact of this, I mean, moving forward, of this kind of meeting?
I think the most significant change in the dialogue over the last 50 years is that we had a shift in perspective. Before it was predominantly what divides us, and now it has shifted to what do we have in common. So there's a joint document from the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation named From Conflict to Communion.
Right.
And that really points it out. And I think focusing on that we are one in Christ is the most important thing, and we kind of missed that point in the last 450 years before the dialogue restarted.
Mm-hmm. Now, that was the theme of this visit.
Yeah.
Is there a theme for the commemoration this year?
For the commemoration, it's the worldwide theme of Liberated by God's Grace, which points to the most significant point in Reformation, because it's all about grace. That's the emphasis that we make on the gospel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, can you explain to us more about, what is this commemoration? Because it's not something that's just lasted a couple of days when the Pope was there.
Oh, yeah, sure.
This is lasting the
Sure.
whole year.
I mean, it all started in the time of Reformation in 1517, when Martin Luther, a reformer in Germany, put 95 Theses up on the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And he basically was driven by the question, how do I get a gracious God? How can I experience that God is merciful? Because he was kind of trapped in all that medieval theology. And so he studied again scriptures, and he discovered for himself that God is a graceful God, a merciful God, that God is a loving God. And he pointed that out, and he couldn't find it in the church of his time so much. So that's why all the Reformation movement started. And since then, it's been the most significant point in our theology, pointing to God's grace and that God is merciful.
Right.
And so that rediscovery from the scriptures, that's what we essentially celebrate. And again, which opens up an ecumenical perspective, because we are all Christ-centered, right?
Right, right.
So.
What's unique about the Lutheran faith?
Yeah, I would say, initially it was that Luther emphasized on you have to preach in the language of the people. So he translated the gospel into German, and then afterwards in other countries they started translating it in their language. And he emphasized on songs and sermon and readings in people's language instead of having a Latin liturgy. So that's been embraced by the Catholic Church as well, the Second Vatican Council kind of emphasized on the same thing. So we are pretty much on the same perspective now. But that is, for us, has been a big thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And what is next in the dialogue between Catholics and Lutherans?
That's a good question. I guess, first of all, everybody's happy that it happened, right? It happened, and that was a warm-hearted encounter. If you watch the videos on YouTube about that event, you can see it's not so much of a diplomatic encounter, very stiff, and it was really heartfelt from both sides. And I guess that's what sustains ecumenical encounters, So according to my experience, when we met on a congregational level with our parishes, people are already there, right? They discover, okay, we worship the same Christ, we have the same questions, we just love to worship our God, and we can do that together. And since we have lots of mixed marriages, for example, it is for many people a very practical issue that they can worship together. So I guess what I've heard on the grassroots level, what many people long for is that we can invite each other for Holy Communion. From the Lutheran side, it's already very open because we say Christ invites us. And also from the Catholic side, I've seen once in a while hospitality.
Right.
I've studied for a year in Jerusalem on Mount Zion in Domitian Abbey, Catholic institution. And I don't know if it's wise to say that publicly, but they basically practice hospitality, and it was really a blessing.
What does hospitality mean? Like, what would that word mean?
To me, it would mean that we invite each other for Holy Communion, right? I know that this is like from doctrine perspective, and it is a big thing, and it would be a big step forward, and we are not yet there. But the fact that it was mentioned on Monday's worship service from both sides shows that there's maybe more conversations going on in the background that we don't know about, but I've great hopes about that.
What is being done in your church here in Toronto for the commemoration?
Yeah, we are actually right now in preparation for the big year, and we'll have a similar service like that one in Lund here in Toronto. So on September 30th, the Archbishop here and our Lutheran Bishop will meet and celebrate basically the same liturgy as it happens all over in Canada. Like in at least 12 places from coast to coast to coast, we'll have joint common prayers as we've seen it in Lund. And I think it's significant, and it shows the world that we do not only talk about reconciliation, but we make it happen within our churches. So, and that's, I think, the biggest witness that we can give to the world, where a lot of reconciliation is obviously needed.
Thank you so much, Reverend Christian, for taking the time to explain to us, to help us understand a little more the commemoration and moving forward too, like what we can hope for in
Thank
this
you
dialogue.
very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Last Friday, 27 new members were appointed to the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. Among those nominated are the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, as well as Archbishop of Quebec and Canada, Cardinal Gérald Cyprien Lacroix, and Bishop Arthur J. Serratelli of Paterson, New Jersey. The congregation, as it is known today, was established in 1975 by Pope Paul VI, and it deals with all the questions regarding the liturgy and the celebration of sacraments. Every month, the Holy Father releases his prayer intentions through the global initiative launched by the Pope World Prayer Network in the United States. The Pope's evangelization intention for November is that within parishes, priests and lay people may collaborate in service to the community without giving in to the temptation of discouragement. And his universal intention:
¿Puede un país afrontar por sí solo las dificultades que produce la emigración forzada? Debemos pasar de la indiferencia y del miedo a la aceptación del otro. Porque ese otro podría ser tú o yo. Súmate conmigo en esta petición. Que los países que acogen a gran número de refugiados y desplazados sean apoyados en su esfuerzo de solidaridad.
If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send them via Vatican Connections Twitter page at Vatican Connections. I'll be happy to answer them on our next episode. That's all for tonight. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next week.